It was supposed to be an uneventful night. As a beat cop in a small town, you learn to treasure the calm, the rhythmic hum of crickets, the occasional bark of a stray dog, and the distant flicker of lights from homes where families had long since settled in for the evening. I had parked my patrol car just off the highway, near the edge of the dense woodland that bordered our town. It was my usual spot for catching speeders or checking for the occasional out-of-place vehicle. But that night, something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The radio crackled with the faint voice of dispatch. Unit 4, we've got a report of a possible disturbance out by the old Grayson farm. Neighbors heard yelling. Address is 137 Elm Creek Road. I acknowledged the call, grabbed my flashlight, and pulled the patrol car back onto the road. The Grayson farm had been abandoned for years, a decaying relic of a time when agriculture thrived in this area. Overgrown weeds had consumed the once pristine fields, and the barn's roof sagged like a tired sigh. I couldn't imagine why anyone would be out there, especially at this hour. When I arrived, the place was shrouded in darkness, save for a faint flicker of light seeping through the cracked boards of the old farmhouse. My headlights illuminated the driveway, where I spotted a rusted pickup truck with its driver's side door ajar. The vehicle wasn't familiar, and the peeling bumper stickers suggested it had seen better days. This is Unit 4, I said into the radio. I'm at the Grayson farm. There's a vehicle on site. Gonna check it out. Copy that, dispatch replied. I approached the truck cautiously, flashlight in one hand and my other resting on the grip of my sidearm. The cab was empty, but the keys dangled from the ignition, and a pack of cigarettes sat on the dashboard. Whoever had driven here was likely still around. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, like rust or blood. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area. The barn loomed to my left, its doors hanging crookedly on their hinges, while the farmhouse stood dead ahead. The light inside flickered erratically, as though from a dying bulb or a fire. I radioed in again. Entering the property. Stand by. The porch creaked under my weight as I ascended the steps. The door was ajar, revealing a narrow hallway lit by a single lantern. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled of mildew and something else, something acrid. Hello? I called out. My voice echoed through the empty house. No response. As I moved further inside, my flashlight beam landed on a series of muddy footprints leading from the front door to a staircase at the end of the hall. The prints were fresh, still damp. My heart thudded in my chest as I followed them, the creak of the floorboards beneath my boots amplifying the silence. Police! If anyone's here, make yourself known! I announced, my voice firm. Still nothing. The footprints led upstairs. The second floor was even darker, and the air felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I swept my flashlight across the hallway, catching glimpses of faded family portraits and cracked doors. One door at the end of the hall stood open, spilling a faint glow into the corridor. As I approached, I could hear it, a soft, wet sound, like something being dragged or scraped. My stomach churned. When I stepped into the room, I froze. The scene before me was a nightmare. A man knelt in the center of the room, his back to me, illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern. In his hands he held a large knife, its blade glinting with fresh blood. At his feet lay a body, motionless and grotesquely twisted. The man was humming, a low, tuneless melody that sent chills down my spine. "Drop the knife and put your hands where I can see them," I barked, drawing my weapon. The man didn't react. He continued humming, his head tilted slightly to the side as if listening to something only he could hear. I repeated the command, louder this time, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain composed. Finally, he stopped humming and slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and wild. Blood smeared his hands and clothes, and his lips curled into a chilling smile. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice soft but laced with menace. "Put the knife down! Now!" I demanded. He cocked his head, as if considering my words, then stood in one fluid motion. The knife dangled at his side, the tip dripping crimson onto the wooden floor. They told me you'd come, he said cryptically, taking a step toward me. Stay where you are, I yelled, my finger tightening on the trigger. Instead, he lunged. Time seemed to slow as I fired, the deafening crack of the gunshot shattering the tense silence. The man stumbled, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck, but he didn't go down. Instead, he let out an animalistic growl and charged again. I fired twice more, the shots finding their mark. He collapsed to the floor, the knife clattering from his grasp. Blood pooled beneath him as his labored breaths filled the room. I kicked the weapon away and called for backup, my voice shaky. Suspect down, I reported. Send medical assistance to 137 Elm Creek Road. 1 victim deceased, suspect wounded. As I waited for backup, I examined the room. The victim, a man in his late 30s, judging by his appearance, had been brutally attacked, his throat slashed and his chest marred with deep gashes. The scene was gruesome, but it told a story. This wasn't random. The killer had taken his time, his actions methodical and deliberate. When the suspect's breathing grew faint, I knelt beside him. Why? I asked, unable to keep the desperation from my voice. He smiled weakly, blood staining his teeth. He deserved it, he whispered. They all do. Before I could press further, his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp. Paramedics arrived moments later, but it was too late. He was gone. The investigation that followed revealed chilling details. The suspect, identified as Alan Reeves, had a history of violence and a troubling obsession with vengeance. The victim was a former acquaintance accused of wronging Reeves years ago. Reeves's notebook, found in the truck, contained detailed plans and a list of names, people he believed had wronged him. The Grayson farm had been his hideout, a place where he could act out his twisted sense of justice. In the end, Reeves's reign of terror ended that night, but the scars he left behind lingered. The image of his deranged smile and the lifeless body on the floor haunted my dreams for weeks. I had stopped a killer, but the darkness he carried had brushed against me, leaving a shadow I couldn't quite shake. Some nights, when the wind howls and the shadows seem to move on their own, I find myself back in that room, staring into the eyes of a man consumed by his demons. And I wonder, if I hadn't arrived when I did, how many more names on that list would have been crossed off. The night air clung heavy with humidity, carrying the faint scent of rain and the distant hum of cicadas. My name is Officer Daniel Harrington, and I've seen my share of strange things in this sleepy little town. Nothing, however, could prepare me for the nightmare that began on a warm September night when I responded to a seemingly routine call. I'm not one to believe in fate, but it almost felt like the universe had been holding its breath for this moment. It started with a missing person report. Sarah Bennett, a 22-year-old college student, hadn't returned home after going out to meet friends the night before. Her parents were frantic, their worry crackling over the phone line as they pleaded for someone to find her. In a town as small as ours, a missing person is rare, and a young woman's disappearance is enough to shake everyone to their core. I was assigned to the case along with my partner, Officer Tracy Monroe. Tracy and I had been working together for 3 years, and while she often joked about my paranoid instincts, she knew better than to dismiss them outright. We started by tracing Sarah's last known movements. Her friends told us she'd left their hangout spot, a diner off Route 14, around 11 p.m. She'd planned to walk the half-mile to her apartment, but she never made it. The stretch of road between the diner and her apartment was poorly lit, bordered by thick woods on one side and an old, abandoned factory on the other. As we combed the area for clues, Tracy pointed out a gap in the chain-link fence surrounding the factory grounds. The torn metal edges looked recent, as if someone had forced their way through. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I nodded. "Let's take a look." The factory had been closed for nearly 2 decades, its hulking structure a relic of the town's industrial past. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. We moved cautiously, our flashlights illuminating graffiti-covered walls and rusted machinery. It didn't take long to find the first clue, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a jagged edge of metal. It was pale pink, matching the description of the dress Sarah had been wearing. "She was here," I murmured, my stomach knotting. Tracy's expression hardened. "Then where is she now?" We followed a trail of disturbed dust and scattered debris deeper into the building, eventually finding ourselves in what appeared to be an old storage room. That's when we saw it, a crude altar in the center of the room, surrounded by candles that had burned down to stubs. On the altar lay a series of objects, a lock of blonde hair, a necklace, and a photograph of Sarah. My heart sank as I recognized the girl's smiling face in the picture. "This just got a lot more complicated," Tracy said, her voice low. We called it in, and soon the scene was swarming with officers and forensic technicians. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department and the town. People whispered about cults and rituals, their imaginations running wild with every new piece of gossip. But for me, the case became personal. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. One name kept coming up: Jacob Marsh, a reclusive man who lived on the outskirts of town. Jacob had a reputation for being odd, even unsettling. He rarely left his property, a sprawling parcel of land filled with makeshift sheds and overgrown vegetation. When we arrived at his property to question him, the atmosphere was oppressive. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. Jacob greeted us at the door, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke. "I don't know anything about that girl," he said, his voice trembling. "You should be looking somewhere else. This is just routine questioning," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Mind if we take a look around?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to something behind us before nodding reluctantly. "Fine. But you won't find anything." As we searched the property, the unease in my gut grew stronger. Jacob's house was cluttered and chaotic, but it was the barn out back that drew our attention. Inside, we found more signs of something deeply disturbing, symbols etched into the wooden beams, animal bones scattered across the dirt floor, and a journal filled with incoherent ramblings about cleansing and sacrifices. "We're going to need a warrant to dig deeper," Tracy said as we left. That night I couldn't sleep. Images of Sarah's picture on that altar haunted me, mingling with the bizarre symbols and Jacob's shifty demeanor. Something about this case didn't feel like a coincidence. I decided to go back to the factory alone, against protocol, driven by an instinct I couldn't ignore. The factory was even more foreboding at night. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness as I retraced our steps to the storage room. This time, I noticed something we'd missed before, a trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of debris. It was heavy, but I managed to pry it open, revealing a set of stairs that descended into the earth. The air grew colder as I descended, the faint sound of dripping water echoing in the narrow passage. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a labyrinth of tunnels, their walls carved from damp stone. The space felt alive, as if the shadows were watching me. I pressed on, my pulse racing with every step. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled cry. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnels twisted and turned, disorienting me, but the cries grew louder, guiding me. Finally, I reached a small chamber, and there she was, Sarah, bound and gagged but alive. Relief flooded through me as I rushed to untie her. "It's okay," I whispered. "You're safe now." But as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. A figure emerged from the shadows, and my blood ran cold. It was Jacob, his face twisted in a mask of rage. "You don't understand," he snarled. "She's part of the cleansing. You can't stop it. Stay back," I warned, drawing my weapon. Jacob lunged at me, and the next few moments were a blur of chaos. We struggled, the confined space making it difficult to move. Somehow, I managed to overpower him, pinning him to the ground until backup arrived. Tracy's voice crackled over the radio as I called for help, and within minutes, officers flooded the tunnels, securing Jacob and rescuing Sarah. In the days that followed, the full extent of Jacob's plans came to light. He'd been part of a small but dangerous group fixated on ancient rituals and twisted beliefs. Sarah had been chosen as their next victim, but our intervention had stopped them in their tracks. The town began to heal, but for me, the scars remained. I couldn't forget the darkness of those tunnels, or the evil I'd confronted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jacob's face, heard his chilling words. The case was over, but the memories lingered, a reminder that even in the quietest towns, monsters can hide in plain sight. The call came in at 2:45 a.m., shattering the fragile calm of the graveyard shift. Dispatch related as a disturbance, a loud noise complaint from a remote cabin on the outskirts of town. As Officer Caleb Donovan, I was accustomed to the odd hours and the even odder calls that came with working in a small mountain town like Ridgeway. But something about this one set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the quaver in the dispatcher's voice or the eerie silence that followed her words, as though the town itself were holding its breath. The cabin belonged to a man named Richard Greer, a reclusive ex-con who'd been living off-grid since his release from prison a decade earlier. Locals said he'd turned his life around, keeping to himself and bothering no one. Still, the rumors persisted, stories of strange sounds coming from the woods at night, of hikers who wandered too close to his property and came back rattled, speaking of shadows that moved where no light could reach. The drive out there was uneventful, the cruiser's headlights slicing through the inky darkness. Ridgeway's mountain roads were treacherous, winding through dense forests that seemed to press in on all sides. I'd driven this route a dozen times before, but tonight, the trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Greer's cabin was a modest structure, weathered by time and the elements. A single bulb cast a sickly yellow glow over the porch, revealing a screen door that hung slightly askew. I killed the engine and stepped out, the night air cool against my skin. There were no sounds beyond the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a shroud. I knocked on the door. Ridgeway Police Department. Mr. Greer, are you home? No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open under the force of my fist, revealing a dark interior that smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, something acrid and metallic. My gut told me to call for backup, but the voice in my head reminded me that Ridgeway had exactly 3 officers on duty tonight, and they were all tied up with a car accident on the other side of town. Mr. Greer? I called, stepping inside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a living room cluttered with books, newspapers, and empty beer cans. A rifle hung on the wall above a threadbare couch, its barrel polished to a mirror shine. The cabin seemed abandoned, but the air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, as though the walls themselves were watching me. I moved cautiously, my hand resting on the grip of my sidearm. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, each step echoing in the silence. The kitchen was empty, its counters littered with unwashed dishes and a half-eaten sandwich that had begun to grow mold. A staircase led to the second floor, and I hesitated, listening for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. Mr. Greer, this is the police. If you're up there, make yourself known. The tapping stopped. My pulse quickened as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like a leap of faith. The hallway at the top was narrow and dark, lined with closed doors. The tapping resumed, louder now, coming from the farthest room. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trained on the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see something moving. I pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted me turned my stomach. The room was empty save for a wooden chair in the center, its surface marred by deep scratches. A raccoon hung limply from a length of rope tied to the ceiling, its body swaying gently. The tapping had been its claws brushing against the chair as it moved. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Scrawled across the walls in what looked like blood were the words, "He is here." I radioed for backup, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dispatch, this is Officer Donovan. I've got a potential crime scene at Greer's residence. Requesting immediate assistance." "Acknowledged," came the reply. "Backup is en route." As I waited, I searched the rest of the house, finding nothing but more unsettling signs of someone unhinged. Drawers had been emptied, their contents scattered across the floor. The bathroom mirror was shattered, the sink stained red. In the basement, I found a workbench covered in tools, some rusted, others gleaming as though recently cleaned. A map of the surrounding forest was pinned to the wall, marked with dozens of red X's. My stomach churned as I realized one of the X's was less than a mile from the cabin. By the time backup arrived, I'd pieced together a rough idea of what might have happened. Greer wasn't just a recluse, he was a predator, stalking the woods and claiming his victims in secret. The evidence was circumstantial, but it painted a chilling picture. Over the next few days, we combed the forest near the cabin, uncovering shallow graves marked by the red X's on Greer's map. The bodies were in various states of decay, their identities confirmed through missing persons reports spanning nearly a decade. The press dubbed him the Ridgeway Butcher, and the town descended into a state of collective shock. But Greer was nowhere to be found. Weeks turned into months, and the search grew colder. Leads dried up, and sightings became little more than rumors whispered in hushed tones. Some believed he'd fled into the wilderness, living off the land as he had before. Others thought he'd taken his own life, his body hidden in the dense undergrowth. I wasn't convinced. Men like Greer didn't disappear, they waited. The nightmares started soon after. I'd wake in a cold sweat, my mind replaying the sight of those words on the wall, the lifeless eyes of his victims staring up at me from their graves. Sleep became a luxury, and every call I responded to felt like it could be the one that brought me face to face with the man who'd haunted my waking and sleeping hours. Then, 1 year to the day after that fateful call, the silence broke. It was another disturbance report, this time from a hiker who'd heard screams near a trailhead on the edge of town. When I arrived, the scene was eerily familiar. The woods were quiet, the air thick with tension. I followed the trail, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The screams had stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness. That's when I saw him. Greer stood in a clearing, his back to me, his shoulders hunched. His hands were covered in blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. At his feet lay another victim, their face unrecognizable. He didn't run when I called out to him, didn't resist when I ordered him to his knees. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something that almost resembled relief. "You finally found me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Greer was sentenced to life without parole, his name etched into Ridgeway's history as a cautionary tale. The town began to heal, but the scars remained, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. As for me, I stayed on the force, though the nightmares never truly left. Every time I close my eyes, I see those words scrawled across the walls of Greer's cabin, a chilling echo of the evil that once hid in plain sight. Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, it takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.